Okay, well, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Ted Toadvine, who's a professor at Penn State and director of the Rock Ethics Institute. If you don't know him, he's published lots of stuff in modern European philosophy and environmental ethics, including a really excellent book on Merleau-Ponty called Merleau-Ponty's Philosophy of Nature, which I would recommend to all of you. He's also edited loads and loads of stuff, and I'm really pleased to have him here talking about phenomenology and environmental ethics as well, I guess. So the paper Ted's going to give is entitled Future Fossils, Phenomenology and the Crisis of Time in the Anthropocene. Okay, thanks a lot, Ted.
Yes, well, thank you, Henry, and thank you to the Center for Continental Philosophy for the invitation to speak to you today. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you. So in the virtual sense of that. And I know that it's Friday afternoon for you. I'm envious of the fact that gin and tonic hour is not far off for you, but it's still coffee drinking time of the day for me here at 9 in the morning. So I'll try to channel some of my caffeinated energy into our conversation. And I'll also just mention that the talk that I'm presenting today is part of my book that's currently under review, titled The Memory of the World, Deep Time, Animality, and Eschatology. So that's not yet in a bookstore near you, but I hope that will change before long. So with that said, I'll just jump right into the main event. The designation of divisions in the geological timescale might seem like a relatively trivial matter of scientific nomenclature, but the proposal to name the current geological epoch the Anthropocene has generated unusually vigorous interdisciplinary debate. And what many people have found attractive in the language of the Anthropocene is simply the claim that human beings have become the dominant influence on Earth systems at a planetary scale, with unprecedented impacts on the atmosphere, ecosystems, and biodiversity. And this is presented as a shift from the scale of our impact prior to the Anthropocene, with, of course, a great deal of debate about when that shift occurred with the advent of fossil fuel use or colonialism or agriculture and so on. Now, of course, the claim that human beings are altering the planet on a global scale is not news to environmentalists who have discussed this for more than a century. And if anything, this formulation seems a bit outdated and politically naive, as many in the humanities and social sciences have pointed out. The Anthropocene designation suggests that the root cause of global environmental problems is anthropos, a generalized or abstract conception of humanity. This obscures the historical, political, and economic context that has made the disruption of Earth's systems possible, enriching some while destroying the lives and livelihoods of others. So it would seem that this designation just replays a well-worn strategy of blaming human nature, thereby rationalizing and naturalizing colonial and capitalist violence. So summarizing these criticisms, Jeremy Baskin concludes that, quote, as a concept, the Anthropocene appears overall to legitimate the dominant order, even if unintentionally, unquote. And this is why an entire series of alternatives have been proposed: Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Thulocene, and a number of others. There is, however, another reason that the Anthropocene label has proven attractive, which is because it suggests a veneer of scientific objectivity, as if it names something empirically tractable even to hard physical sciences such as geology. Because in its strictly scientific sense, the Anthropocene refers to the factual prediction that human beings are leaving a trace in the geological record comparable to other traces that mark, for geologists, the transitions between stages on the geological timescale. When geologists agree on a reference point in rock strata that marks such a transition, they designate it as a global boundary stratotype section and point, a GSSP. These are colloquially termed golden spikes, even though the official markers of these spots are not always golden and they're not always spikes. But briefly put, the Anthropocene designation would require international agreement on the specific human-caused traces in geological strata comparable to other distinct transitions in the fossil record that signal the boundary between the Holocene and the Anthropocene, and that will remain legible into the far future at geological scales of time. Now, identifying these stratigraphic reference points, or golden spikes, that is the work of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and they have yet to make a formal decision concerning the Anthropocene. But among the reference points that have received serious discussion are sedimentary evidence of species extinctions and introductions, ice cores marking climatic changes, artificial technofossils from human refuse, and I believe that currently the leading option, probably the one, if they do go with this designation, what they will actually use are radionuclides from atomic bomb testing. And so the claim is that humans will have left such a mark of transition between geological stages. And this is a claim essentially about our own future fossils and their legibility for imagined future paleontologists. So as Claire Colebrook puts it, quote, "From the capacity to read our own inhuman past, we can imagine an inhuman future that would read our human present." I think that's a very nice formulation. Now, because this proposal reverses the temporal perspective from which all GSSP designations have been made up to this point, because it bases this designation on a prediction rather than on reconstruction of events from the deep geological past, because it reverses the temporal perspective, it calls for an entirely different kind of evidence and different methods than with other golden spikes. And this makes the Anthropocene both distinctive and controversial as a scientific claim. Some geologists, in fact, dismiss these predictions about the legibility of our own fossil record and see the claim itself as evidence of our profound hubris insofar as it reflects an inflated sense of our own significance for and influence on the unimaginably long expanse of the future. In any case, it's clear that the shift from reconstructing the past to predicting the future tracks a shift in aims. Scientific proponents of the Anthropocene as a geological designation are clear that their motives are not purely or even primarily scientific at all, but in fact political. Paul Crutzen, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist credited with popularizing the notion of the Anthropocene, along with other Earth system scientists, have promoted this idea as, in their own words, a wake-up call concerning the self-destructive actions of our species. And so in this respect, the scientific version of the Anthropocene reveals itself to actually be a pseudo-scientific sleight of hand, presenting a putative factual prediction about the future as justification for a political agenda today. From this perspective, the Anthropocene is only the latest in a series of efforts to dress up normative claims as scientific discoveries, which I have argued elsewhere is also the case with the so-called biodiversity crisis. Now, against this background, it's easy to see why the intervention of post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has attracted a great deal of interest. In his widely cited 2009 essay, The Climate of History, 4 Theses, Chakrabarty introduced the idea that anthropogenic climate change implies the collapse of the distinction between natural history and human history. And in his subsequent work on this topic, he argues that critiques of capitalism and globalization can't tell the whole story because they're limited to the perspective of human history, what he terms the global perspective. To this, he contrasts what he calls the planetary perspective, adopted by Earth system scientists, which is concerned not with human history, but with deep geological time. So none of this, Chakrabarty says, none of this is to deny what post-colonial critique has demonstrated concerning differential contributions to global problems. But the challenge, as he frames it, is precisely, in his words, to mix together the immiscible chronologies of capital and species history. And presumably then, Chakrabarty's intent is to defang the criticisms levied against the Anthropocene concept for its flattening of human differences and for its failure to recognize the role of capital and colonialism in creating the conditions for a subset of the human population to become drivers of planetary systems, he would say such criticisms remain enclosed within the global and the human perspective, and they have no real bearing on the planetary perspective that now interrupts our lives from what he calls an absolute outside. So I find it helpful to consider the various formulations that Chakrabarty introduces to identify this, what he calls a temporal incongruence. The fact that humans have become geological agents, he says, collapses the distance between the two calendars, namely geological time and the chronology of human histories. Or again, in his words, the geologic now of the Anthropocene has become entangled with the now of human history. Or one more formulation, the wall between human and natural history has been breached. Now, this way of framing the issue puts the relationship between human and geological time at the very center of what we need to learn from the Anthropocene as two temporal registers, histories, calendars, or chronologies that have become fused, collapsed, entangled, or breached. These are all formulations that Chakrabarty uses. And the problem that he poses is therefore how to encounter together, that's also his phrase, planetary and global forms of thinking that are disparate yet intertwined, and that refer to vastly different and incommensurable scales of time. So the stakes of this problem concern not only our environmental future, but also how we are to understand humanity as a form of life and in relation to other forms of life. Many critics of the language of the Anthropocene have pointed out that to blame environmental destruction on the human species risks universalizing and normalizing a small portion of humanity. But for Chakrabarty, references to the human species by proponents of the Anthropocene are connected to the enterprise of deep history and planetary thinking, in contrast with the merely human history with its emphasis on the global and on critiques of capital. So he defends the language of the human species, if only, as he puts it, as a placeholder for an emergent, new, universal history of humans that flashes up in the moment of danger that is climate change, end of the quote from Chakrabarty. So tarrying with the language of human species in this way opens, he believes, a perspective on the extra-historical conditions for the existence of life in the human form and our relation with the history of life on the planet. Now, to be clear, Chakrabarty does not claim to have solved the problem of mixing the immiscible or of fusing global and planetary thinking beyond their incommensurable scale of time. But he is clear that we should expect no help from phenomenology, and he repeatedly dismisses the possibility of anything like a phenomenological approach to geological history or to the planetary perspective, because he holds that these are essentially inaccessible to direct human experience. As it is approached through Earth systems science, our planet is an object of astronomical and geological studies, and one that is necessarily considered as just one planet alongside others. Consequently, it is never really our planet, but rather a planet seen from the outside, a planet that confronts us with, he says, vast processes of unhuman dimensions and with radical otherness. Now, in his efforts to articulate what is distinctive about the Anthropocene challenge, Chakrabarty returns repeatedly to the figure of the Earth in Husserl and Heidegger, each time concluding that the geological and planetary have displaced the phenomenological account of Earth, insofar as the latter continues to bear an essential reference to the human. The strife between Earth and world that interests Heidegger may be relevant from the perspective of human dwelling, but it can say nothing about the astronomical and geological dimensions of the planet, nor about the history of life that the planet encompasses. And following Derrida's lead, Chakrabarty concludes that the unity of Husserl's originary Earth, the Earth that does not move in Husserl's famous Irmster's fragment, that this arises out of the unity of all humanity. So this relation to humanity places Earth, for Chakrabarty, on the side of the worldly and global, and over against the planetary. And this is consistent with Derrida's reading that the unity of humanity in question is correlative to the unity of the world as the infinite horizon of experience, and not to the unity of this earth here. Quote from Derrida. In short, because the phenomenological earth never severs its natal bond with humanity, it remains on the hither side of the worldly and global, rather than broaching the alterity of the planetary. Now, Chakrabarty's strategy here is, I believe, profoundly indebted to the speculative realism of Quentin Meillassoux, whom he cites approvingly in this context. And it's well known that Meillassoux, in After Finitude, criticizes the correlationism, as he calls it, of phenomenology, which he claims encloses it within a subjective perspective. And Meillassoux argues that this leaves phenomenology incapable of accounting for or even accepting the existence of a time before or after human existence on the planet. And it prevents phenomenology from ever escaping the confines of its subjective prison in order to encounter the great outside of what does not submit to correlation with subjectivity. Now, Chakrabarty apparently accepts this logic, but he also adapts it to his own concepts, so that the correlation becomes the global world essentially bound up with human history, and the planet becomes the great outside that vastly exceeds our myopic temporal and cognitive perspectives. I've discussed my criticisms of Meillassoux' claims elsewhere, but here I want to offer some reasons why I also reject their creative appropriation by Chakrabarty under the banner of the global and the planetary. So to start, let's recognize that the framing of the issue as a collapse or a breaching of human and natural history, understood as two distinct chronologies, that this starting point is a vast oversimplification. No doubt due to Chakrabarty's starting point of identifying the limits of what is counted as history by academic historians. Of course, we are neither inside human history nor outside natural history. So the breaching or the collapsing here strictly only concerns our scholarly constructions of temporal narratives, but not our lived experience of time nor the temporalities of nature. Furthermore, the juxtaposition of human history over against inhuman time suggests a simple binarism of chronologies, while in fact, we are always enmeshed within innumerable temporal scales, flows, eddies, and percolations. For example, my experience of time at this moment, or this week, or this year, the time of my life and of the lives of those with whom my life overlaps, the known history of my family tree, human written history and unwritten history, the span of organic evolution all the way back to life's earliest common ancestor, geological time encompassing the entire history of the planet, and cosmic time since the Big Bang. In short, we are moments of passage and becoming for innumerable overlapping and intersecting temporal happenings. And these happenings are neither punctual nor discrete, but mutually implicated. In the concept of nature, Whitehead notes that, quote, the passage of nature, which is only another name for the creative force of existence, has no narrow ledge of definite instantaneous present within which to operate. Its operative presence, which is now urging nature forward, must be sought for throughout the whole, in the remotest past, as well as in the narrowest breadth of any present duration, perhaps also in the unrealized future. That's the end of the quote from Whitehead. Now, commenting on this text, Merleau-Ponty proposes that we understand nature as, quote, the memory of the world, unquote. And on this view, our experience of time is corporeal as well as cognitive, and at both levels, it's a consequence of the fact that we are ourselves pulses within the passage of nature. Consequently, the memory of the world, the entire span of nature's passage, is constitutive of our experience of time. In short, we do not need to build a bridge from lived time to geological time, and any barriers between them have always been breached. If deep time is not split off from lived and historical time, one implication is that deep time is not a mathematical extrapolation of clock time, but is essentially historical. And here I'm indebted to the account of historical time proposed by Jerome Miller in the context of what he terms robust evolution. Clock time, or time as a variable in scientific equations, consists of invariant standard units that are repeatable. As standard units, any one moment can be substituted for any other. In historical time, by contrast, past, present, and future are irreducibly heterogeneous, and this is why each moment is unique and datable. It follows that the future is not simply the next repetition of an invariant temporal atom. It is not reducible to another present. And in Miller's words, the future is essentially unlike what precedes it. It is unprecedented. For it to be the future, it must be essentially heterogeneous from the present. Quoting Miller, it's always already breaking the present open to possibilities that cannot be assimilated into it, unquote. So Miller calls this the traumatological character of historical time, which is its inherent capacity to undo, to rupture. Clock time, on the other hand, is precisely a strategy for managing this world-shattering potential of the future, which it attempts to by assimilating this future as merely one more present in an homogeneous series of presents. Now, elsewhere, I've discussed how sustainability projects that extrapolate from deep past trends to predict and manage far future scenarios. I'm thinking of things like the planning around the world's first long-term nuclear waste repository in Finland, which is set to open in just a few more years, that these engage in a comparable effort to manage the risk of the future as such. What is at risk with every future is the disruption or the undoing of what the present carries within itself from the past. That is, the future essentially risks a loss of the world's memory, as that memory constitutes each unique and singular present. So, for example, extinction is a standing risk presented by the disruptive future for any form of life. And with that risk comes the possibility of the loss of memory that every form of life embodies. This notion of memory returns us to the question that Chakrabarty has posed regarding our relation to the history of life. Now, life has often been understood as a kind of organic memory. So, for example, Elizabeth Gross, taking inspiration from Bergson, writes that, quote, life, even the simplest organic cell, carries its past with its present as no material object does, unquote. Now, today, the most straightforward way of understanding this notion of organic memory is undoubtedly through the genetics of evolutionary descent. So this is what evolutionary biologist George Williams has in mind when he writes that, quote, the generation of diversity by cladogenesis being the differentiation of the phylogenetic tree, the generation of diversity by cladogenesis furnishes every population with a unique set of historical legacies. In this sense, an organism is a living record of its own history. This is the quote from biologist George Williams. Now, so far so good, but I think we can enrich this understanding of organic memory immensely by approaching life in diacritical terms. So let me say what I mean by that. Merleau-Ponty introduces the notion of diacritical difference to describe language as a system consisting only of differences without positive terms, as he explains in the opening lines of his 1952 essay, Indirect Language and the Voices of Silence. Let me give you a little quote from Merleau-Ponty. He writes, what we have learned from Saussure is that taken singly, signs do not signify anything, and that each one of them does not so much express a meaning as mark a divergence of meaning between itself and other signs. Since the same can be said for all other signs, we may conclude that language is made of differences without terms, or more exactly, that the terms of language are engendered only by the differences which appear among them. That's the end of this quote from Merleau-Ponty. Now, as a system of differences without terms, language has, in Merleau-Ponty's words, a unity of coexistence, this is a quote from Merleau-Ponty again, a unity of coexistence like that of the sections of an arch that shoulder one another. So, end of that quote. So this insight requires us to take relations as more basic than their relata, so that difference precedes and constitutes identity. This is why we learn a language more through our bodily appropriation of its differences, as mimicry and gesture, for example, than through cognitive association of symbols with representations. And the expressive potential of language is a function of its inexhaustible power of differentiating, while words, syllables, and letters are just the sediments left in its wake. Meaning is therefore to be found not in these positive byproducts, but rather in the intervals and interruptions of the differential relations that produce them. So far, so good. Now, in his last decade, Merleau-Ponty gradually came to extend this idea of diacritical difference beyond language, first to perception, and then ultimately to ontology, so that his final ontology of flesh is described in diacritical terms. But what I want to focus on here is his suggestion that life is diacritical. So in the notes for his final course on the concept of nature in 1959 and 1960, we find the following remark, quoting Merleau-Ponty: "Life is not a separable thing, but an investment, a singular point, a hollow in being, an invariant ontological relief. The establishment of a level around which the divergences begin forming, a kind of being that functions like an arch. But life is not negativity, it is a pattern of negations, a system of opposition that means that what is not this is that." It's the end of the quote from Merleau-Ponty. So here Merleau-Ponty describes life using the same example of the arch, the stones that hold each other up without external support, by which he had initially described the diacritical system of language. So the suggestion is that life, just as much as language, is a creative and expressive set of differences rather than a collection of things or positive terms. Now, I've argued elsewhere that this diacritics of life, or biodiacritics as I'm calling it, offers a more compelling account of what we find significant in the diversity of life than does the received scientific concept of biodiversity. Now, the next step would be to complete this account of biodiacritics by understanding each form of life as a memory in a richer sense than mere genetic inheritance. So we might take our start from a famous example of Richard Dawkins that is intended to illustrate the evolutionary continuity between humans and chimpanzees. So bear with me while I sketch out for you this example from Dawkins. He suggests that we imagine holding the hand of our mother, while she holds the hand of her mother, and she holds the hand of her mother, in a long continuous line. And imagine that we allow about a yard for each individual, and we trace the path of this line into the evolutionary past about 300 miles. So you're holding your mother's hand, she's holding her mother's hand, and it goes on for 300 miles. Now at that point, your ancestor, my ancestor, would reach out her hand and grasp the hand of her other child. And that child would hold the hand of her child, who holds the hand of her child, in a new line that retraces each generation back to the present. And so we're going to think about these two lines facing each other, leading back to your ancestor, and then leading forward into the future from that ancestor's other child. And when the second line completes itself in the present day, we find ourselves linked through a continuous connection of hands to our nearest evolutionary relation, the modern chimpanzee, with whom we stand face to face. Now, this thought experiment does an impressive job of helping us picture our evolutionary kinship with our nearest non-human relatives. And it can obviously be extended further into the past to illustrate our common ancestry with invertebrates, with plants even. But this image is still too tied to kinship by descent and filiation. And if we want a truly biodiacritical understanding, we would need to recognize that each individual along this chain, along every evolutionary line of descent, is what it is only through the myriad relationships that shape its mode of life. That is, with what it eats and with what eats it, with what it competes with for food, with the parasites, microbes, and viruses that colonize it, the trees that provide it shelter, the microbial associations that allow those trees to grow, the landscape that offers those trees an opportunity to seed, the climate in which all of these forms of life can flourish, and even the landforms and the hydrology, the soil, and all of the geological conditions that these relationships require. Now, if we understand biodiacritics in terms of the full network of relationships that make any continuity of life possible, then we must say that every living organism is the diacritical memory of all of those relationships in pleats and folds that gather the full duration of evolutionary time. So following this out, the unity of life can be understood as an expressive diacritical network comparable to a language. And every node of organic difference, from genes to organisms to species, exists precisely as the immanently articulated difference from all others, including the pattern and investments through which it has taken form over the course of evolutionary time. To be a living creature, then, is necessarily to be the embodied memory of an entire evolutionary history of expressive divergences. Donna Haraway writes, quote, "All critters share a common flesh, laterally, semiotically, and genealogically," unquote. And when Merleau-Ponty generalizes this diacritical ontology to all beings understood as flesh, this suggests a diacritical account of time as ontological memory, that is, as the concentration of the entire evolutionary history of life into each moment of every organism's life. And this entire condensed history is at stake in every future, because not only death, but even extinction is always a possible undoing of this diacritical memory. So the future as such is unprecedented because it can wipe away the world's memory, just as it can instead continue to sustain it, as we talk about a musical note that is sustained, or as it can introduce a creative ferment or a swerve that we never saw coming. Now, I've tried to say something about what it means for time to be historical, and in a sense that extends to the entire age of the universe, and that brings the world as memory to bear on each moment as it passes. The uniqueness and singularity of the present is precisely a consequence of the way that the past bears down on it, such that it could not be substituted for any other present. But this is also what makes each present vulnerable to the undoing that is its own heterogeneous future. And here we could draw parallels with what Jean-Luc Nancy, with his call to respect the singularity of the present, rather than submerging it into a homogenizing equivalence with other nows. The historical character of time that I'm describing can't be represented by a line, nor counted by a clock, and this is why neither human history nor natural history can be represented as linear chronologies. In fact, as the diacritical account of memory suggests, we endure innumerable temporalities and mutual implication. Michel Serres suggests that we abandon the linear perspective of time altogether in favor of something more topological, pleated or crumpled time, for example, which allows for the possibility that moments we think of as separated by a thickness of past or future can in fact be in close relation. In Serres' words, time is, quote, "an extraordinarily complex mixture, as though it reflected stopping points, ruptures, deep wells, chimneys of thunderous acceleration, rendings, gaps, all sown at random. That's the end of the quote from Michel Serres. So to be clear, I'm not speaking here of a subjective experience of time, but rather of our visceral immersion in the temporal flows that form and reform us, flows or interruptions that condition any possible experience of time. We resonate with these multiple pleated and entangled flows of time across the intersecting scales of the cosmic, geological, organic, cultural, familial, and personal. And that means that the deep past, even the geological or cosmic past, still reverberates through our bodies, and our explicit awareness of time is formed against this background of our corporeal participation in the time of stones and stars. We might say that as pulsations within the grand memory of the world, we are also memories, carrying within ourselves the echoes of all of the temporal processes that converge on our present moment and open it to the future. Extending this notion of memory, Michel Serres also proposes that we consider each and every thing to be a memory, a kind of inert or asubjective memory that awaits translation into active remembrance. So as he puts it, quoting Michel Serres again, insofar as I am a memory, I participate in things. Insofar as they are things, they have memory, unquote. In this light, the planetary perspective that Chakrabarty describes with such care is not so much false as it is forgetful, since it takes for granted the perceptual and temporal relationships that every scientist and every one of us maintain with the singular Earth. As Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, "Truth of perception, there is no objectivity without a point of view in itself. That is, an observer is necessary with his levels, his soil, his homeland, his perceptual norms, in short, his Earth, which is not fixed in the sense of the pre-Copernicans, but not simply a moving object within a system of relative movements." That's the end of the quote from Merleau-Ponty. So here Merleau-Ponty is clearly referring to the short fragment, Foundational Investigations on the Phenomenology of Nature, in which Husserl claims that Earth, in the originary sense, is earth ground, as the ground against which all motion and rest become possible, that this Earth cannot in itself be said to move. This primordial sense of Earth has been displaced, of course, by our modern notion of the Earth as one relative moving body among others, that is, precisely as one planet among others. But this new sense is an accomplishment with a history, one that remains essentially conditioned by Earth's originary spatiality and temporality. In short, the planetary would be meaningless without the Earth as our unique Earth ground. Now, in his late course on the possibility of philosophy today, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, "Show that access to other planets does not relativize the Earth and does not make a corpor out of the others, but on the contrary, that such access extends to other planets the function of a pre-objective Boden. The other planets become annexes of the Earth, or the Earth expands, but one is always someplace," unquote. Now, as I've noted above, Chakrabarty holds that Husserl's account of the Earth as experiential ground is challenged by the Anthropocene. Since the unity of the Earth for Husserl arises out of the unity of all humanity, it falls short of the inhuman perspective of the planetary. And here I've mentioned that Chakrabarty is following Derrida's reading, that the unity of humanity in question here is, in Derrida's words, correlative to the unity of the world as the infinite horizon of experience, and not to the unity of this Earth here. End of the quote. Otherwise put, Derrida finds that Husserl's fragment does not present a transcendental account of Earth in its own right as the one Earth here. The Earth as the factical index of the world, which is itself to be understood as the correlate of humanity. Now, rather than dismissing the contribution of a phenomenological account of Earth, then, We might instead conclude that Husserl, and arguably Heidegger as well, that they failed to disentangle earth from world, or to offer a genuine account of earth in transcendental terms. But it's also possible to approach Husserl's text from another angle, such as that taken by Merleau-Ponty in his late course on Husserl at the Limits of Phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty finds at least the beginnings of another path here in Husserl's text, according to which, as he writes, the foundation of the unity of history is the uniqueness of the earth, unquote. Rather than the unity of earth being a byproduct of the unity of world horizons for transcendental intersubjectivity, the earth shares a mutually implicatory relation with our flesh as the very ground of space and time. Merleau-Ponty admits that Husserl does not follow through on this insight, and perhaps this is why in his nature lectures, Merleau-Ponty turns from Husserl's earth to Whitehead's account of our temporal implication in the passage of nature. Whitehead makes explicit our relation of mutual immanence, as he calls it, with nature. And he even expresses this relation as a chiasmus. Whitehead writes, "We are in the world and the world is in us." Now, this does not describe an anthropomorphizing correlation, but instead the lived basis for our engagement with incommensurable and asubjective temporalities. In this case, the unity of humanity and of all earthly life would rest on the uniqueness of the earth, not as a scientific representation, but as the memory that is constitutive of our being from within. The emergent universal history of life that Chakrabarty seeks would then be found in our mutual implication in the unique history of the earth, since that is what makes us all earthlings. Now, my aim here has been to sketch the beginnings of a phenomenology of deep time, that is, to offer an account of how the multiple crumpled scales of time play across us as material and living beings. And this is certainly a messier picture of our relation to time than Chakrabarty's simple diptych of global and planetary calendars that are breached by the Anthropocene. I do not see how this distinction between global and planetary enriches our understanding of our relation to deep time. And consequently, I do not see how it can serve to defend the autonomy of Earth system science or to deflect those critics who see in the notion of the Anthropocene just a new Prometheanism. Furthermore, I believe the ahistorical interpretation of geological time, as this is approached from a planetary mindset, is already an effort to assimilate the future as just one more present. Modeled on this homogeneous and ahistorical time, sustainability becomes the effort to preserve the world of the present as we know it and as we would like it to be, precisely by preventing the arrival of the future as such. From one perspective, the future within historical time is essentially apocalyptical as the very condition of history. But the management of time and of the planet to prevent the future, especially a future that undoes our present and our past, this is an apocalypse for history rather than an apocalypse within history. In this sense, I believe that the eschatological imaginary of our own future fossils is a recoil from and a repression of the genuine future and its power to undo all prediction and management. Is human extinction a genuine possibility? Yes, absolutely, and at every moment. Will the management of the planet by Earth system scientists do anything to change that? No, not at all. Can we make our present much worse? Yes, precisely by framing our relationship with time in a way that liquidates our liability to the past, obscures the singularity of the present, and refuses the unprecedented future. In short, by denying any historical character of planetary time, Chakrabarty creates the very bifurcation that he would like then to label the Anthropocene. Phenomenology suggests a more fruitful path. Husserl describes the world as the horizon of horizons, the ultimate horizon that embraces all possible horizons. But we must then consider the Earth as the temporal horizon of horizons, as the ontological memory, and in equal measures the ontological forgetting, that embodies all possible geological pasts and futures. Nothing guarantees that we have left our mark as an immortal trace in rock, whether we find in that dream a source of secret pride or a cause for shame. What we can know is that the entire history of the Earth expresses itself through every unique moment in time's constellation, that we have in common this shared memory, and that every future, as future, risks its ruin. None of this relieves our responsibilities to nature or to each other. On the contrary, it's only as the confluence of innumerable temporal flows and eddies, as the elemental duration of my bones and the evolutionary duration of my organs, that I can first appreciate my own singular and unique responsibility to the earth and to my fellow earthlings. Thank you.